When desperate mail-order bride Eleanor Hayes offered to marry the caged mountain man, everyone feared she had no idea she was about to save not just his life, but discover a love that would defy an entire town's hatred and transform two broken souls into an unbreakable force. Welcome to our story that spans the untamed American frontier, where love blooms in the most impossible places. Stay with us until the very end to see how this incredible tale unfolds, and don't forget to comment with your city so we can see how far our story has traveled across the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fowl Ridge as Eleanor Hayes stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her worn leather satchel clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The September heat was already oppressive, and the small frontier town stretched before her like a mirage of broken dreams. She had traveled 3 weeks from Ohio, following the promises in carefully penned letters from a man named Thomas Whitmore, a man who was supposed to be her husband by sunset. But Thomas Whitmore was nowhere to be found. "Ma'am, you getting off here or not?" The stagecoach driver's gruff voice cut through her paralysis. His weathered face showed no sympathy for her obvious distress. Yes, this is my stop." Eleanor's voice barely rose above a whisper as she gathered her few possessions. The driver handed down her small trunk with obvious impatience, eager to continue his route to the next settlement. As the stagecoach rumbled away in a cloud of dust, Eleanor stood alone in the middle of what passed for Fowl Ridge's main street. The town was smaller than she had imagined, maybe 24 buildings clustered around a central square, most of them weathered and sun-bleached. A few curious faces peered at her from doorways and windows, but no one approached. She walked slowly toward what appeared to be a general store, her heeled boots clicking against the hard-packed earth. The weight of her trunk made her arm ache, but she pressed on, hoping someone inside might know where to find Thomas Whitmore. The bell above the door jangled as she entered the dim interior of Morrison's general store. An elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from mild interest to something like pity when he took in her appearance. "You must be the mail-order bride," he said without preamble. "Heard tell someone was coming for Tom Whitmore." "Yes, I'm Eleanor Hayes. I was supposed to meet Mr. Whitmore today. Do you know where I might find him?" The old man. "Morrison?" She assumed, shook his head slowly. "Tom lit out of here 3 days ago, miss. Took everything he owned and headed west. Left word he changed his mind about the whole arrangement." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, her carefully planned future crumbling around her. He changed his mind." "Happens more than you'd think," Morrison said, not unkindly. "A lot of men get cold feet when it comes time to actually take a wife, though I got to say Tom could have had the decency to send word." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had spent nearly every dollar she possessed on the journey west responding to Thomas's letters that promised a comfortable home and a stable life. Now she was stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a single night's lodging. Is there a boarding house? Somewhere I might stay while I figure out what to do. Mrs. Hutchins runs a place down the street. Clean beds, decent food. Cost you 50 cents a night, though. 50 cents. Eleanor calculated quickly she had maybe $3 left to her name. Enough for a week if she ate sparingly, but then what? The reality of her situation began to sink in like a stone in her chest. "Thank you," she managed, gathering her dignity around her like a shawl. I'll be on my way." She turned toward the door, but Morrison's voice stopped her. "Miss Hayes, there's a crowd gathering in the square. You might want to take the long way around." Through the window, Eleanor could see people moving toward the center of town, their voices carrying on the hot air. Curiosity overrode her caution, and she decided to see what had drawn the entire town's attention. The scene that greeted her in the town square would haunt her dreams for years to come. In the center of the dusty plaza stood a crude wooden cage barely large enough for a man to stand upright. And inside that cage, sitting with his back against the rough bars, was the most striking man Eleanor had ever seen. He was tall, she could tell even with him seated with broad shoulders that strained against a torn cotton shirt. His dark hair hung to his shoulders unkempt and wild, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. Storm gray and intense, they held a depth of pain that made her chest tighten. Around the cage, perhaps 30 townspeople had gathered, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear and cruel entertainment. Some of the men carried bottles, their voices growing louder with each drink. Women held their children close, pointing at the caged man as if he were some exotic animal. "Look at him," one of the women was saying to her young son. "That's what happens to men who give in to the devil's ways. You remember that, Billy?" "When they gonna hang him, Papa?" A boy of maybe 10 called out to his father. "Soon enough, boy. Judge O'Brien's coming through tomorrow. Won't be long now." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The man in the cage seemed oblivious to the crowd, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the gathered townspeople. There was a stillness about him that spoke of resignation, but underneath it she sensed something else, a quiet strength that even imprisonment couldn't break. What did he do? She found herself asking the woman standing nearest to her. The woman turned, taking in Eleanor's traveling clothes and obviously Eastern origins. "You're new here, aren't you? That there's Jacob Stone, murdered a man in cold blood over in Cedar Falls. They brought him here to await trial, but everyone knows he's guilty as sin." "How do you know he's guilty?" The woman's eyes widened at the question. "Look at him, living up in those mountains like some kind of wild animal. Never comes to town, never talks to decent folk. That kind of isolation, it turns a man savage." Eleanor studied the man in the cage more carefully. His clothes were worn but clean. His hands, visible through the bars, were calloused but not dirty. Despite his wild appearance, there was something almost gentle about the way he held himself, like a wounded animal, trying not to show its pain. "They say he killed Samuel Garrett with his bare hands," another voice chimed in. "Snapped his neck like a twig." "Samuel was just trying to help him," added an older man. "Offered him work food, a chance to rejoin civilized society. This is how he repaid that kindness." As the crowd continued their speculation and condemnation, Eleanor found herself studying Jacob Stone's face. She had seen guilty men before. Her father had been a judge back in Ohio, and she had sat in his courtroom many times. Guilty men usually carried their crimes in their eyes, a shifty defiance or callous indifference. This man's eyes held neither. What she saw instead was grief. Raw, overwhelming grief that seemed to emanate from his very soul. "When's the hanging?" someone called out. "Judge O'Brien will be here tomorrow morning," replied a man wearing a sheriff's badge. "Trail's just a formality. Whole town saw him brought in and we got witnesses to what he done." "Should string him up now," muttered a voice from the back of the crowd. "Save the territory the cost of a trial." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered people, and Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. She had heard stories of frontier justice, but seeing it firsthand was different. These people had already decided this man's fate regardless of what any trial might reveal. The man in the cage, Jacob Stone, finally raised his head and looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the hostile crowd, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. It was as if he could see straight through to her soul, recognizing a kindred spirit in the midst of his tormentors. His lips didn't move, but she heard a question in that gaze as clearly as if he had spoken. "Are you like them?" Without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward. The crowd parted, slightly surprised by her movement toward the cage rather than away from it. "Have you had water today?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet square. Jacob Stone blinked as if her question was the last thing he had expected to hear. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Food." This time he shook his head. The sheriff stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Miss, you don't want to be talking to him. He's dangerous." "He's in a cage," Eleanor replied evenly. "How dangerous can he be? Don't let his current situation fool you," the sheriff warned. "This man is a killer. You'd best stay back." Eleanor ignored the warning and moved closer to the cage. Up close, she could see the details that the crowd's fear and hatred had obscured. Jacob Stone's clothes were patched but carefully mended. His hands, while work roughened, showed the calluses of a craftsman rather than a brawler. Most telling of all, when she approached the bars, he immediately moved back, putting distance between them, not the action of a man who meant her harm. "What's your name?" she asked softly. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, in a voice rusty from disuse, he spoke a single word: "Jacob." The sound of his voice seemed to startle the crowd. Several people stepped back as if his words might somehow contaminate them. "Well, Jacob," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm Eleanor, and I think these people have made up their minds about you without knowing the whole story." A nervous laugh came from somewhere in the crowd. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. called out a man in a dusty brown suit. "This animal killed Samuel Garrett in cold blood. We got witnesses." "What witnesses?" Eleanor asked, turning to face the speaker. The man's confidence faltered slightly. "Well, Marcus Garrett Samuel's brother, he found the body, and it was clear what happened. But no one actually saw the killing." "Didn't need to see it," the sheriff interjected. "Samuel was found dead on Stone's property, beaten to death. Stone was the only one around for miles." Eleanor turned back to Jacob, who was watching the exchange with something that might have been hope flickering in his gray eyes. "Is that what happened, Jacob? Did you kill Samuel Garrett?" The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for his answer. Jacob's gaze never left Eleanor's face as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the tense air. "He came to my cabin. At night. With others. They had torches." "That's a lie," someone shouted from the crowd. "Samuel went there alone to offer him work." But Eleanor had heard enough truth in those few words to recognize it. She had also heard enough fear and pain to understand that whatever had happened between Jacob Stone and Samuel Garrett, it wasn't the simple case of murder the town wanted it to be. The sheriff was growing agitated. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the prisoner. You're interfering with..." "With what?" Eleanor interrupted. "With your entertainment. This man hasn't been tried yet. As far as I know, he's still innocent until proven guilty." "Not out here, lady," the man in the brown suit called out. "Out here, a man's judged by his actions, and Stone's actions speak pretty clear." The crowd was beginning to get restless, their earlier festive mood turning ugly. Eleanor realized she was walking a dangerous line, but something about Jacob Stone's quiet dignity in the face of their hatred made her unwilling to back down. "Sheriff," she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear, "what would it take for this man to avoid hanging?" The question caught everyone off guard. The sheriff frowned, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. "Ma'am, he's going to be tried tomorrow. If he's found guilty, which he will be, he'll hang. That's the law." "But what if he wasn't available for trial? What if he was, say, married to a respectable woman who could vouch for his character?" The murmur that went through the crowd was electric. Several people started talking at once, their voices rising in confusion and outrage. "What are you suggesting?" the sheriff demanded. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, but her voice remained steady. "I'm suggesting that if Mr. Stone were to marry a woman of good standing, someone who could provide for him and ensure he lived as a law-abiding citizen, the territory might be willing to commute his sentence to exile rather than execution." The sheriff's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious." "Why not?" "It would solve several problems. The town would be rid of him. He would have a chance at redemption, and territorial resources wouldn't be wasted on a trial and execution." From inside the cage, Jacob Stone was staring at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. It was clear he had no idea what she was planning, but he seemed to sense that his life might hang in the balance of whatever happened next. "And just who," the sheriff asked with heavy sarcasm, "would be fool enough to marry a murderer?" Eleanor reached into her small purse and withdrew the one valuable item. She still possessed a delicate gold ring that had belonged to her grandmother. She held it up so the afternoon sun caught its surface, making it gleam like a tiny star. "I would," she said clearly. "I'll marry him." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the crowd burst into derisive laughter, while the other half erupted in outraged protests. Women clutched their children closer as if Eleanor's words might somehow contaminate them. Men shook their heads in disbelief, several making crude comments about her sanity or moral character. Through it all, Jacob Stone sat perfectly still, his gray eyes locked on Eleanor's face with an intensity that made her knees weak. She could see him trying to understand not just what she was proposing, but why she would do such a thing for a complete stranger. "Miss Hayes," the sheriff said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining official dignity, "you can't possibly be serious. You don't know this man. You have no idea what he's capable of." "I know that he moved away from the bars when I approached instead of toward them," Eleanor replied. "I know that he answered my questions honestly instead of trying to manipulate me, and I know that he's shown more courtesy in the last 10 minutes than this entire town has shown me since I arrived." The last comment hit home, and several faces in the crowd flushed with shame. It was true no one had offered to help the stranded mail-order bride, but they were all eager to watch a man hang. "This is ridiculous," declared the man in the brown suit. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for something. She's clearly not in her right mind." "On what charges?" Eleanor asked coolly. "Last I checked, proposing marriage wasn't a crime even in the territories." The sheriff was clearly out of his depth. "Ma'am, even if what you're suggesting was legal, which I'm not sure it is, no judge would agree to it." "Then let's ask Judge O'Brien when he arrives tomorrow," Eleanor suggested. "In the meantime, I assume Mr. Stone will need food and water for the night." Before the sheriff could object, Eleanor had already started walking toward Morrison's general store, leaving the entire crowd staring after her in stunned silence. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of voices as everyone tried to talk at once, but she didn't look back. Inside the store, Morrison was waiting with barely concealed excitement. Clearly, he had heard every word through his open door. "Miss Hayes," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've seen some foolish things in my 30 years out here, but that might just take the prize. Do you have any prepared food? Bread, maybe some jerky? You're serious about this, aren't you?" Morrison studied her face carefully. "You really mean to marry that man?" "I really mean to keep him from hanging for a crime I don't believe he committed." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, then began gathering items from around the store. "Bread, jerky, some cheese. There's a water barrel behind the jail where they can give him fresh water." He paused, studying her with curious eyes. "What makes you so sure he didn't do it?" Eleanor considered the question as she counted out coins for the food. "Have you ever seen a man who's truly grieving, Mr. Morrison? I mean, grieving so deeply that it's broken something inside him?" "Can't say that I have." "My father was a judge. I saw a lot of guilty men in his courtroom, and I saw a few innocent ones too. Jacob Stone isn't carrying guilt, he's carrying grief. Grief so heavy it's nearly crushed him." Morrison handed her the bundle of food, his expression thoughtful. "Even if you're right about what he's carrying, that doesn't mean he didn't kill Samuel Garrett." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it means the story isn't as simple as everyone wants it to be." When she emerged from the store, she found the crowd in the square had grown even larger. Word had apparently spread through the town like wildfire, and people were streaming in from surrounding farms and businesses to see the Eastern woman who wanted to marry the caged killer. Eleanor walked through the crowd with as much dignity as she could muster, ignoring the whispered comments and pointing fingers. At the cage, she found Jacob Stone exactly where she had left him. But now his eyes tracked her every movement with an intensity that was both unnerving and oddly comforting. "I brought you some food," she said, kneeling beside the cage to pass the bundle through the bars. Their fingers brushed as he took the package, and Eleanor felt a jolt of electricity run up her arm. Jacob felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes widened slightly, the way he almost jerked his hand back before forcing himself to remain steady. "Why?" he asked, his voice so low that only she could hear it. Eleanor glanced around at the hostile faces surrounding them, then looked back into those storm-gray eyes. "Because everyone deserves a chance to tell their story, and because I don't think anyone has listened to yours." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, carefully unwrapping the food. When he spoke again, his words were barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're offering." "I know exactly what I'm offering," Eleanor replied with more confidence than she felt. "The question is, are you willing to accept it?" Before Jacob could answer, a new voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "What in the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted to reveal Judge Thaddeus O'Brien, an imposing man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His sharp eyes took in the scene, the caged man, the kneeling woman, the agitated crowd, and his expression grew thunderous. "Sheriff Patterson," he barked, "explain this situation immediately." Sheriff Patterson hurried forward, his face red with embarrassment. "Judge O'Brien, this is Miss Eleanor Hayes. She's proposing to marry the prisoner." Judge O'Brien's eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline. "She's what?" Eleanor rose gracefully, brushing dust from her skirts. "Your Honor, I'm proposing an alternative to execution. If Mr. Stone were to marry a woman of good character who could ensure his rehabilitation and integration into civilized society, perhaps the territory would consider exile rather than hanging." The judge stared at her for a long moment, then burst into laughter. Miss Hayes, I've heard some creative defense strategies in my time, but this is a new one. His laughter faded as he studied her face. You're serious? Completely serious, Your Honor. Judge O'Brien walked slowly around the cage, studying Jacob Stone with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every type of criminal the frontier could produce. Jacob met his gaze steadily, showing neither defiance nor submission. Stone, the judge said finally, what do you have to say about this proposal? Jacob glanced at Eleanor, then back at the judge. I don't understand why she would do it. Neither do I, O'Brien admitted. Miss Hayes, you've known this man for what, an hour? You have no idea what kind of person he is, what he might be capable of. I know he's capable of gentleness, Eleanor replied. I know he's capable of honesty. And I know he's capable of bearing more pain than most people could survive. The judge's expression grew thoughtful. Those are interesting observations, but they don't change the fact that he's accused of murder. Accused, Your Honor, not convicted. The evidence is pretty clear, Miss Hayes. Samuel Garrett was found dead on Stone's property, beaten to death. Stone was the only person within 20 miles. Eleanor felt Jacob tense beside her, but when she glanced at him, he was still staring straight ahead, his face carefully blank. Your Honor, she said carefully, has anyone asked Mr. Stone what happened that night? The prisoner has remained silent since his arrest. Sheriff Patterson interjected. Won't say a word about what happened. Maybe he hasn't found anyone worth talking to, Eleanor suggested. Judge O'Brien's eyes sharpened with interest. Are you suggesting the prisoner might be more forthcoming with you, Miss Hayes? Eleanor looked at Jacob, who was now watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I think Mr. Stone has learned not to trust easily. But yes, I think he might be willing to tell the truth to someone who's willing to listen without judging. The judge was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision. Finally, he turned to address the crowd. I'm going to clear this square. Everyone who doesn't have official business here needs to move along. A chorus of protests rose from the gathered townspeople, but Judge O'Brien's voice cut through them like a blade. I said move along. This is official territorial business now, and I won't have it conducted as public entertainment. Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered at the edges of the square, clearly hoping to overhear whatever happened next. When only the judge, sheriff, Eleanor, and Jacob remained, O'Brien pulled out a folding chair and sat down heavily. Miss Hayes, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to talk to the prisoner. If he's willing to tell you what happened the night Samuel Garrett died, and if his story makes sense, I'll consider your proposal. But I warn you, if this is just some elaborate scheme to help a guilty man escape justice, you'll find yourself sharing his fate. Eleanor's mouth went dry, but she nodded. I understand, Your Honor. The judge waved his hand impatiently. Go on then, talk to him. Eleanor knelt beside the cage again, acutely aware that every word she and Jacob spoke would be overheard by the judge and sheriff. Jacob was watching her with an expression of such intensity that she felt as if he were trying to see into her very soul. Jacob, she said softly, I need you to tell me what really happened the night Samuel Garrett died. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him, he began to speak. They came at night, 3 of them. Samuel and 2 others I didn't recognize. They had torches and rope. Eleanor's blood chilled, but she kept her voice steady. What did they want? Samuel said they were there to make me an offer, said I could come work for him, live in his barn, earn my keep like a decent man, but the way they came in the dark with rope, it wasn't an offer. What did you do? Jacob's hands clenched into fists. I told them to leave, said I wasn't interested in their offer. Samuel got angry, started talking about how I was an animal living up there alone, how it wasn't natural. Said they were going to bring me down to town, whether I wanted to come or not. Eleanor could feel Judge O'Brien leaning forward to catch every word. Then what happened? Samuel grabbed me, tried to force the rope around my hands. I pushed him away, but he came at me again, had a knife. Jacob paused, his breathing becoming labored. I hit him, just once. He fell and he didn't get up. What about the other 2 men? They ran. Soon as Samuel went down, they dropped their torches and ran. Eleanor glanced back at Judge O'Brien, who was frowning thoughtfully. Jacob, why didn't you tell this to the sheriff when they arrested you? For the first time, Jacob's carefully maintained composure cracked. Because who would believe me, a hermit living alone in the mountains against Samuel Garrett, pillar of the community? They'd already decided I was guilty before they even put me in this cage. Judge O'Brien stood up slowly, his chair creaking as he rose. Stone, you say there were 2 other men with Samuel that night. Do you know who they were? Never seen them before, but one of them had a scar here. Jacob touched his own cheek, indicating a line from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. The judge and sheriff exchanged a meaningful look. That sounds like Pete Morrison, Sheriff Patterson said quietly, and if Pete was there, chances are good his brother Danny was the 3rd man. The Morrison brothers work for Marcus Garrett, Judge O'Brien mused, Samuel's brother. Eleanor felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, so Marcus Garrett sent his men along with his brother to bring Jacob back to town by force. That's what it sounds like, the judge agreed grimly, which would make this a case of self-defense rather than murder. A new voice cut through the evening air like a gunshot. That's a damn lie. All heads turned to see a man on horseback riding hard into the square. He was tall and broad-shouldered with the same strong jaw and piercing blue eyes that Samuel Garrett had possessed. Marcus Garrett had arrived and he looked ready for blood. Marcus dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Judge O'Brien, I heard there was some fool woman trying to interfere with my brother's killer getting what he deserves. Mr. Garrett, the judge said carefully, we were just hearing Mr. Stone's version of what happened that night. Stone's version? Marcus's voice was thick with rage. Stone is a lying murderer who beat my brother to death with his bare hands. There's nothing more to it than that. Eleanor found herself standing, placing her body between Marcus and the cage. Mr. Garrett, did you send men with your brother that night? Men with rope and weapons? Marcus's eyes narrowed dangerously as he focused on her. Lady, you don't know what you're messing with here. My brother was a good man trying to help a savage rejoin civilization. That savage repaid his kindness with murder. That's not what happened, Eleanor said firmly. Your brother came with 2 armed men to force Jacob from his home. Jacob defended himself when they tried to take him by force. You weren't there, Marcus shouted, taking a step closer. You don't know anything about what happened. Neither were you, Eleanor shot back. But the Morrison brothers weren't they, Pete and Danny Morrison, who work for you? The color drained from Marcus's face, and Eleanor knew she had hit her mark. Behind her, she could hear Jacob stirring in the cage, but she didn't dare take her eyes off Marcus Garrett. Judge O'Brien's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Mr. Garrett, I think we need to have a conversation about what really happened that night, and I think we need to have it with the Morrison brothers present. Marcus's hand tightened on his gun, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might actually draw it. Then with visible effort, he forced his hand away from the weapon. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But when this is all over, when the truth comes out, I want this murderer to hang, and I want anyone who helped him to answer for it too. His eyes locked on Eleanor's, and she saw a promise of violence that made her blood run cold. But she didn't step back, didn't show the fear that was crawling up her spine like ice. The truth is all any of us want, Mr. Garrett, she said quietly. I'm confident it will set everything right. As Marcus stalked away to find the Morrison brothers, Eleanor allowed herself to sink back down beside the cage. Her hands were shaking with reaction, but when she looked at Jacob, she saw something new in his storm-gray eyes. It was hope. Thank you, he said so quietly that only she could hear. Eleanor reached through the bars and without thinking covered his hand with hers. Don't thank me yet. This is far from over. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Fow Ridge, Eleanor Hayes knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside Jacob Stone, the man she had offered to marry, and the man she was beginning to suspect might just be worth saving. The night was far from over, and by morning, both their lives would be forever changed. The first pale light of dawn was creeping across the eastern horizon when Judge O'Brien finally returned to the town square, his face grim with exhaustion and something that might have been disgust. Eleanor had spent the entire night sitting beside Jacob's cage, dozing fitfully against the rough wooden bars while he kept silent vigil in the darkness. Neither had spoken much through the long hours, but there had been a strange comfort in their shared silence, 2 souls finding solace in each other's presence while the town slept around them. Sheriff Patterson emerged from the jailhouse behind the judge, followed by 2 men Eleanor recognized as the Morrison brothers. Pete Morrison's distinctive scar was clearly visible in the growing light, just as Jacob had described it. Both men looked haggard and defeated, their clothes rumpled from a night in custody. Marcus Garrett was nowhere to be seen. "Miss Hayes," Judge O'Brien called out, his voice hoarse from the long night of interrogation, "please step away from the prisoner. We need to discuss some developments." Eleanor rose stiffly, her muscles protesting after hours of sitting on the hard ground. Jacob's eyes followed her movement, and she caught a flicker of concern in his expression. Not for himself, but for her. The realization sent warmth spreading through her chest despite the morning chill. "Your Honor," she said, smoothing her wrinkled skirts. "What did the Morrison brothers tell you?" Judge O'Brien pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time before answering. "They told me quite a story, Miss Hayes, one that corroborates Mr. Stone's account of that night in every significant detail." Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief, but she forced herself to remain standing. So Jacob was defending himself. According to Pete and Danny Morrison, yes, they claim Marcus Garrett hired them to accompany Samuel that night with explicit instructions to bring Stone back to town by force if necessary. Samuel was supposed to make the offer of work first, but if Stone refused, they were to bind him and drag him down the mountain. Eleanor glanced at Jacob, who was listening to every word with an expression of carefully controlled hope. "Then Jacob is innocent of murder." "Of murder, yes," the judge agreed. "Though there's still the matter of Samuel Garrett's death. Even in self-defense, a man died by Stone's hand." Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. "Judge, there's something else you should know. Marcus Garrett left town about an hour ago, took his horse and rode out hard to the west, left word with the stable boy that he had business to attend to and wouldn't be back." Judge O'Brien's expression darkened. Did he now? How convenient for Mr. Garrett to make himself scarce, just as his hired men decided to tell the truth about that night. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think he's running?" "I think Marcus Garrett is a man who's just realized his plan to eliminate Jacob Stone through legal means has failed," the judge replied grimly, "which makes him unpredictable and dangerous." From inside the cage, Jacob spoke for the first time since the previous evening. "He won't let this go, not Marcus. His family pride means everything to him, and in his mind I killed his brother. Legal or not, he'll want his revenge." Judge O'Brien studied Jacob's face carefully. "You sound like you know Marcus Garrett well, Mr. Stone." "I know his type," Jacob replied quietly. "Men who believe their name and their money put them above the law. Samuel was the same way, thought he could take whatever he wanted, including me." Eleanor stepped closer to the cage, her decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on still water. "Your Honor, my offer still stands. I'll marry Jacob Stone and take responsibility for his rehabilitation and integration into society." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Hayes, given what we've learned about the circumstances of Samuel Garrett's death, Mr. Stone is likely to be found innocent of murder charges. He may not need your unique form of assistance. With respect, Your Honor, you just said yourself that Marcus Garrett is dangerous and unpredictable. Jacob will never be safe as long as Marcus is alive and free. As my husband, he would have legal protections and social standing that he doesn't possess as a solitary mountain man." Judge O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving between Eleanor and Jacob. "Mr. Stone, what are your thoughts on Miss Hayes's proposal?" Jacob's gray eyes met Eleanor's, and she saw a war raging behind them, attitude, battling with pride, hope, fighting against hard-learned caution. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why she would tie herself to someone like me. I have nothing to offer her, no money, no property, no standing in any community. I've been living alone in the mountains for 3 years, and before that—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Before that, I lost everything that ever mattered to me. I'm not sure I remember how to be the kind of man a woman like her deserves." Eleanor's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached through the bars and touched his hand. "Jacob, I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you are. I've seen your character in the last day, your honesty, your dignity, your courage. That's more than most women can hope for in a husband." "But why?" Jacob asked, his fingers closing gently around hers. You could find a dozen men in any town who could give you a better life than I ever could. Men with homes and businesses and futures. Why choose a broken hermit with nothing but ghosts for company? Eleanor looked into those storm-gray eyes and saw something that took her breath away. Not the wild animal the townspeople had painted him as, but a man who had been wounded so deeply that he had forgotten his own worth. In that moment, she understood that her choice wasn't just about saving his life. It was about showing him that he still had value, that he was still worthy of love and companionship. Because, she said softly, sometimes broken things can be mended stronger than they were before. And sometimes two people find each other at exactly the moment when they both need saving. Judge O'Brien cleared his throat loudly, breaking the intimate moment. Well, this is all very touching, but we still have legal matters to resolve. Mr. Stone, if you're willing to accept Miss Hayes' proposal, I'm prepared to perform the ceremony immediately. However, there will be conditions. Jacob's hand tightened on Eleanor's. What conditions? First, you'll be placed on probation for 1 year. Any violation of territorial law during that time will result in immediate imprisonment. Second, you and your wife will be required to establish residence in a recognized community, no more living alone in the mountains. Third, you'll report to the nearest territorial magistrate every 3 months to demonstrate your continued rehabilitation. Eleanor felt Jacob tense beside her. Where would we live? I don't have money for property or a business. Judge O'Brien smiled for the first time since arriving in town. As it happens, Miss Hayes, there's a homestead available about 20 miles north of here near the town of Cedar Falls. The previous owners abandoned it last spring when they decided farming wasn't for them. It's rough, the cabin is half built, the fields are overgrown, but the land is good and the claim is still valid. If you're willing to work it, the territorial government would be happy to transfer the deed. Eleanor's mind raced. A homestead would give them a place to start over, away from the hostile eyes of Fow Ridge, but close enough to civilization to satisfy the judge's requirements. It would be hard work, harder than anything she had ever imagined, but it would be theirs. What do you think, Jacob? She asked, studying his face. Are you willing to try farming again? Something flickered in Jacob's eyes. Surprised that she had said, again, that she somehow knew he had been a farmer before his mountain exile. You don't know what you're asking for, he said quietly. Homesteading is brutal work, dawn to dusk every day fighting the weather and the land and everything else that can go wrong. Most people who try it fail within 2 years. Most people don't have your skills, Eleanor replied with more confidence than she felt. I saw your hands yesterday, Jacob. Those are craftsmen's hands that know how to build and create and coax life from the earth. And most people don't have 2 people working together toward the same goal. Judge O'Brien was checking his pocket watch again. I need a decision, folks. I have other business to attend to, and if we're going to do this, we need to do it now. Eleanor looked at Jacob, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything was happening so fast. 24 hours ago, she had been a stranded mail-order bride with no future, and now she was proposing to marry a man she barely knew and start a new life on the frontier. It was madness. It was terrifying. It was also the first thing that had felt truly right since she had left Ohio. Jacob, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for promises you can't keep or feelings you don't have. I'm asking for a partnership, 2 people helping each other build something better than either of us could manage alone. If that's something you think you could try, then yes, I want to marry you. Jacob was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he would refuse. Then slowly he lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. Eleanor Hayes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If you're willing to take a chance on a man who's forgotten how to hope, then yes, I'll marry you. Judge O'Brien clapped his hands together with satisfaction. Excellent, Sheriff Patterson, release the prisoner and let's get this ceremony underway. Mrs. Hutchins, I know you're listening from behind that door. Come out here and serve as witness. Eleanor had to suppress a laugh as Mrs. Hutchins emerged from the boarding house, clearly having eavesdropped on the entire conversation. The elderly woman's face was flushed with excitement and what might have been embarrassment at being caught spying. Oh my, Mrs. Hutchins fluttered. A wedding, how romantic, though I do wish we had more time to prepare. Miss Hayes, You can't possibly be married in those travel clothes. And Mr. Stone needs a proper shave and— Mrs. Hutchins, Judge O'Brien interrupted firmly. This is a legal proceeding, not a social event. The clothes they're wearing will suffice. Sheriff Patterson had unlocked the cage and Jacob was climbing out slowly, his muscles clearly stiff from the long night of confinement. As he stood to his full height, Eleanor realized just how tall he was, at least 6 feet with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard physical labor. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was an innate dignity about him that no amount of hardship could diminish. Jacob looked around the square as if seeing it clearly for the first time without the bars of the cage between him and the world. His gaze lingered on the faces of the few townspeople who had gathered to watch the proceedings, and Eleanor saw him cataloging their expressions, some curious, some disapproving, most simply confused by the rapid turn of events. "Do you want to wait?" Eleanor asked quietly, sensing his uncertainty. "We could postpone this until you've had time to think." Jacob turned to her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "No," he said firmly. "If you're brave enough to do this, then so am I." Judge O'Brien positioned them facing each other in the center of the square with Mrs. Hutchins and Sheriff Patterson flanking them as witnesses. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the dusty ground and warming Eleanor's face as she looked up at the man who was about to become her husband. "Do you, Jacob Stone, take Eleanor Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Jacob's voice was steady as he replied, "I do." "Do you, Eleanor Hayes, take Jacob Stone to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor's throat was suddenly tight with emotion she hadn't expected. Looking into Jacob's eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, a recognition that they were both taking a leap of faith together, trusting each other with their futures in a way that went far beyond legal obligations. "I do," she whispered. "By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge O'Brien paused, glancing between them with something that might have been amusement. "Mr. Stone, you may kiss your bride." Eleanor's heart stopped. In all her planning and proposing, she hadn't considered this moment, the moment when the reality of marriage would be sealed with the most intimate gesture two people could share in public. She saw uncertainty flicker across Jacob's face, and she realized he was as unprepared for this as she was. Slowly, carefully, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement, Jacob reached up and cupped her face in his calloused hands. His thumbs brushed gently across her cheekbones, and Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. When Jacob's lips touched hers, it was with a tenderness that spoke of reverence rather than passion. The kiss was brief, chaste, but it sent electricity coursing through Eleanor's veins and left her knees weak with surprise at her body's reaction. As they parted, Eleanor saw her own wonder reflected in Jacob's eyes, and she knew that whatever else this marriage might become, it would never be just a legal arrangement for either of them. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Stone," Judge O'Brien said with satisfaction. "Now let's discuss the practical matters. I've prepared the deed transfer for the homestead and your probation papers, Mr. Stone. Mrs. Stone, you'll need to sign as the property co-owner." Mrs. Stone. Eleanor felt a thrill at hearing her new name, even as her practical mind began cataloging all the challenges they would face. She had married a man she barely knew, committed to a life she had never imagined, and tied her fate to someone the world saw as dangerous. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. "Your Honor," Jacob said, his voice carefully formal. "What provisions have been made for our transportation to the homestead? Neither my wife nor I have horses or a wagon." Judge O'Brien smiled. "The territorial government is providing a wagon and 2 horses as part of your settlement package. Consider it an investment in your successful rehabilitation. Sheriff Patterson will escort you to the homestead to ensure you're properly established." Eleanor felt Jacob tense beside her at the mention of an escort, and she understood his reaction. After 3 years of solitude and a night in a cage, the idea of being watched and supervised would chafe against his hard-won independence. How long will this escort arrangement last? Eleanor asked diplomatically. Just for the initial journey and establishment, the judge assured them. Sheriff Patterson will help you get settled, make sure the cabin is habitable, and then leave you to your new life. The quarterly check-ins I mentioned will be handled by the magistrate in Cedar Falls. A new voice cut through the morning air, causing everyone to turn. Well, ain't this just perfect? Approaching on horseback were three men Eleanor didn't recognize, but from Jacob's sudden stillness, she knew they weren't bringing good news. The lead rider was a tall, weathered man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his vest. Behind him rode two younger men with the hard faces of professional gunfighters. "Judge O'Brien," the lead rider called out as he dismounted. "I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan from Cedar Falls. We've been tracking a fugitive, and we have reason to believe he's headed this way." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. "What fugitive, Marshal?" "Marcus Garrett. Seems Mr. Garrett decided he didn't like the way things were turning out here in Fow Ridge. About 2 hours ago, he robbed the bank in Cedar Falls and shot the clerk when the man tried to resist." Deputy Marshal Brennan's eyes fixed on Jacob. "Word is, Garrett was shouting something about getting enough money to finish what his brother started. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Stone?" Jacob's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. "Marcus blamed me for his brother's death. When he learned that I was going to be freed, he must have decided to take matters into his own hands." "That's what we figured," Brennan agreed grimly. "Which is why I'm here to offer you folks some protection. Garrett is armed and dangerous, and he's got nothing left to lose. He's not going to give up easily." Judge O'Brien stepped forward. "Deputy Marshal, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that Mr. and Mrs. Stone accept an escort of 3 armed men for their journey to the homestead, and that we post guards at their property until Garrett is captured or killed." Eleanor looked at Jacob, seeing the frustration and anger in his eyes. He had just been freed from one cage only to find himself trapped in another. But she also saw the resignation, the understanding that Marcus Garrett's hatred had made their freedom conditional at best. "For how long?" Jacob asked quietly. "Until we catch him," Brennan replied bluntly. "Could be days, could be weeks. Garrett knows these mountains better than most, and he's got enough money now to stay hidden for a while." Eleanor made a decision that surprised even her. "Marshal Brennan, my husband and I appreciate your offer of protection, but we decline. We're capable of defending ourselves, and we won't live our lives in fear of one man's vendetta." Every head in the square turned to stare at her, but Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the deputy marshal's face. She could feel Jacob's surprise and something that might have been admiration radiating from beside her. "Ma'am," Brennan said carefully, "I don't think you understand the danger you're facing. Marcus Garrett is a killer now, and he's specifically targeting your husband. This isn't a matter of courage, it's a matter of survival." "Marshal," Jacob said quietly, "my wife is right. We won't be prisoners in our own home hiding behind other men's guns. If Marcus Garrett wants to find me, he will regardless of how many guards you post. I'd rather face him on my own terms than spend my marriage cowering behind armed escorts." Deputy Marshal Brennan shook his head in frustration. "You folks are making a mistake. A big one." "Maybe," Eleanor agreed. "But it's our mistake to make." Judge O'Brien had been listening to the exchange with growing concern. "Mrs. Stone, perhaps you should reconsider. Deputy Marshal Brennan is offering protection that could save both your lives." Eleanor looked around the square at all the faces staring at her, some concerned, some disapproving, most simply curious about what the crazy Eastern woman would do next. Then she looked at Jacob, seeing the pride and gratitude in his storm-gray eyes, and she knew she had made the right choice. "Your Honor, my husband has spent 3 years living alone in hostile territory. He knows how to defend himself, and he's going to teach me. We'll be careful, we'll be smart, but we won't be prisoners." "In that case," Brennan said grimly, "I'll give you one piece of advice. Get to your homestead quickly and ford up. Don't travel at night, don't go anywhere alone, and keep your weapons loaded at all times. Garrett is smart, patient, and now he's desperate. That makes him more dangerous than a cornered wolf." Sheriff Patterson approached with a set of keys in his hand. "The wagon's loaded with supplies and ready to go. Horses are fresh and trail ready. If you're determined to do this alone, you'd best get started. Long ride to the homestead, and you don't want to be caught on the trail after dark." Eleanor felt a moment of panic as the reality of their situation hit her. In less than an hour, she and Jacob would be alone together for the first time, traveling through dangerous territory to a home neither of them had ever seen. They were virtual strangers bound by marriage vows and hunted by a vengeful killer who had nothing left to lose. Jacob seemed to sense her sudden fear. He moved closer, not quite touching her, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "if you want to change your mind, now would be the time. Once we leave this town, there's no going back." Eleanor looked up into his face, seeing the same uncertainty she felt reflected in his expression. But underneath the fear, she saw something else, a determination to protect her, to make their unlikely marriage work, to build something good from the ashes of both their broken dreams. "I'm not changing my mind," she said firmly. "Are you?" Jacob's answer was to offer her his arm, his calloused hand covering hers as she placed it in the crook of his elbow. "Mrs. Stone," he said with the first real smile she had seen from him, "shall we go home?" As they walked toward the waiting wagon, Eleanor heard Mrs. Hutchins calling out behind them, "Good luck, you two, and don't forget to write." The wagon was larger than Eleanor had expected, sturdy and well-built for frontier travel. The horses were strong-looking animals, alert and eager to be moving. In the wagon bed, she could see supplies, sacks of flour and beans, tools, blankets, and what appeared to be building materials. Jacob helped her up onto the wagon seat with a gentleness that belied his rough appearance, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As he did, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch. His hands were shaking slightly. "Jacob," she said softly, "are you all right?" He was quiet for a moment, staring down at the reins in his hands. "It's been 3 years since I drove a wagon with a woman beside me," he admitted quietly. 3 years since I—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Eleanor understood. 3 years since his first wife had died, 3 years since he had been part of a family, 3 years since he had been responsible for anyone's safety but his own. The magnitude of what they were attempting suddenly seemed overwhelming. "We'll figure it out together," she said, covering one of his hands with hers. "One day at a time." Jacob looked at her then, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. A cautious hope that maybe they could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. "Hold on tight, Mrs. Stone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's going to be a long ride." As the wagon rolled out of Fow Ridge and onto the dusty trail that led north toward their new life, Eleanor felt the weight of every decision that had brought her to this moment. Behind them lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the fragile possibility of happiness with a man who was still little more than a stranger. But as the town disappeared behind a rise in the trail and the vast frontier opened up before them, Eleanor Stone felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating terror of being truly alive. The sun climbed higher as their wagon rolled through the endless expanse of prairie grass, and Eleanor found herself studying Jacob's profile as he guided the horses along the faint trail. His jaw was set with concentration, his gray eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. She noticed how his shoulders carried a tension that spoke of years spent watching his back, and she wondered if he would ever truly relax again. "Tell me about the homestead," she said, partly to break the silence and partly because she needed to prepare herself for what they would find at their destination. Jacob was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that surprised her. "I've never seen it. Judge O'Brien's description was all I had to go on." "Then we'll discover it together," Eleanor replied, trying to inject optimism into her voice despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The trail began to wind through low hills dotted with scrub oak and pine, and Jacob pulled the horses to a stop beside a small creek that bubbled cheerfully over smooth stones. "We should rest the animals and eat something," he said, setting the brake. "Still got hours of travel ahead of us." As Jacob tended to the horses, Eleanor explored the wagon's supplies, finding a package of bread and cheese that Mrs. Hutchins had apparently added to their provisions. The simple act of preparing a meal felt strangely domestic, and she caught herself wondering if this was how normal marriages began, with small, ordinary moments that gradually built into something larger. "Eleanor," Jacob's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was standing by the creek, his hat in his hands, looking uncertain. "There's something I need to tell you about what happened before, about why I was living alone in the mountains." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread she was unwrapping. "You don't owe me explanations, Jacob, not yet." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. If we're going to make this work, if we're going to build a life together, you need to know who you married." Eleanor walked over to where he stood, noting how he kept his distance, even as he prepared to bare his soul. "Then tell me." Jacob stared down at the running water, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I had a farm once, down in Kansas. A wife named Sarah and 2 children, Emma, who was 8, and little Thomas, who had just turned 5. His voice caught slightly on their names. Sarah was everything good in the world, patient and kind and strong enough to keep me grounded when my temper got the better of me. Eleanor waited, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever courage he had mustered to tell this story. We'd been having trouble with raiders, men who claimed to be fighting for the Confederacy, but were really just thieves using the war as an excuse for murder and pillage. They'd hit 3 farms in our area, taking everything of value and burning what they couldn't carry. Jacob's voice grew flat, emotionless, and Eleanor recognized it as the tone of a man who had learned to bury pain so deep that even speaking of it couldn't reach it. "I was in town when they came, and Sarah had begged me not to go, said she had a bad feeling, but we needed supplies, and I was too proud to listen to women's intuition." He laughed bitterly. "Pride. That's what killed my family. My damned pride." Eleanor wanted to reach out to him to offer some comfort, but something in his posture warned her that he needed to finish this without sympathy clouding his ability to speak. "When I got home, the house was burning. Sarah and the children were—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "They were in the yard. The raiders had left them there like broken dolls, as if their lives meant nothing more than the livestock they'd stolen." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle sound of water over stones and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "I buried them in the garden Sarah had loved so much," Jacob continued. "And then I loaded my rifle and went hunting. Took me 3 months to track down every man who'd been part of that raid. Some I found in saloons, some hiding in caves, one living fat and happy on a stolen farm with my children's blood money." Eleanor felt ice form in her veins as she began to understand what Jacob was telling her. "I killed them all," he said simply. "Every last one. Not in fair fights or self-defense. I hunted them down like the animals they were and put bullets in their heads. And when it was done, when I'd had my revenge, I realized I couldn't go back to being the man Sarah had loved. That man had died with his family." Jacob finally looked at her then, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her heart break. Not just grief, but a bone-deep conviction that he was irredeemably stained by what he had done. "So I came west as far from Kansas as I could get. Found a place in the mountains where I could live alone and not have to pretend to be civilized. Thought if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else." Eleanor absorbed this revelation in silence, understanding now why the townspeople of Fow Ridge had been so quick to believe Jacob capable of murder. He had been capable of it, had in fact committed it multiple times. But she also understood that the man who had killed those raiders was not the same man who had moved away from the bars of his cage when she approached, who had answered her questions with honesty instead of manipulation. "How long ago?" she asked quietly. "Sarah and the children died 4 years ago. I finished hunting their killers 3.5 years ago. I've been in the mountains ever since." Eleanor walked closer to the creek, her mind racing as she tried to process everything Jacob had told her. She thought about the tender way he had kissed her hand through the bars of his cage, the gentle reverence of their wedding kiss, the careful way he helped her into the wagon. This was not the behavior of a man consumed by violence. "Jacob," she said finally, "do you think Sarah would want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for failing to save her?" He jerked as if she had slapped him. "What?" "Your wife and children. If they could see you now living alone, convinced you're not worthy of love or companionship, do you think that's what they would want for you?" Jacob's face flushed with anger, and Eleanor saw a flash of the man he must have been during his hunting days. "You don't understand. You can't possibly understand what I—" "You're right," Eleanor interrupted calmly. "I can't understand losing a family that way, but I can understand believing you're not worthy of a second chance at happiness." Jacob stared at her, his anger deflating as quickly as it had risen. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sat down on a fallen log beside the creek, smoothing her skirts as she considered how much of her own story to share. "I told you I came west to marry Thomas Whitmore. What I didn't tell you was why I was so desperate to leave Ohio that I'd marry a complete stranger. Jacob moved closer, drawn despite himself by the pain he heard in her voice. My father was Judge William Hayes, a good man respected in the community, devoted to justice and fairness, or so I thought. Eleanor picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in her hands. 2 years ago, a case came before his court, a man accused of stealing horses. The evidence was circumstantial, but the defendant was Irish and poor, and the town wanted someone to blame for a string of thefts. She threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread across the surface. My father knew the man was innocent. I was in the courtroom when he told me privately that the evidence didn't support a conviction, but the political pressure was enormous, and my father was up for re-election. Jacob sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but not quite touching. What did he do? He convicted an innocent man and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Eleanor's voice was flat with old pain. The real horse thief was caught 6 months later, but by then the innocent man had died in prison, killed by another inmate who believed he was a criminal. Eleanor felt Jacob's shock in the sudden stillness of his body beside her. When I confronted my father about it, he told me I was naive, that sometimes individual justice had to be sacrificed for the greater good of social order. He couldn't understand why I was so upset about the death of one worthless Irishman when his re-election had allowed him to serve justice to hundreds of other cases. She turned to look at Jacob, seeing her own pain reflected in his gray eyes. I realized that the man I had idolized my entire life was not who I thought he was. Worse, I realized that by staying silent during the trial, by not speaking up when I knew an innocent man was being railroaded, I had become complicit in his death. Eleanor, Jacob said softly, you couldn't have stopped your father's decision. Couldn't I? What if I had stood up in that courtroom and testified to what my father had told me privately? What if I had gone to the newspapers or written to the territorial governor? Told myself I couldn't destroy my father's career over one case, but the truth was, I was a coward. Eleanor picked up another stone, this one sharper-edged and darker. After the innocent man died, I couldn't bear to look at my father or myself. I felt like everyone in town could see my guilt written on my face, so when I saw Thomas Whitmore's advertisement for a mail-order bride, I convinced myself it was my chance to start over somewhere no one knew what I had done. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. And instead you ended up marrying a man who's actually guilty of the violence you feel responsible for allowing. Eleanor turned to face him, fully struck by the bitter irony he had identified. Yes, except that the man you killed deserved to die, and the man my father condemned was innocent. You acted to avenge your murdered family. I acted to protect my own comfort and reputation. You were young and powerless, Jacob protested. I was a grown man with choices. I was 23 years old, Jacob, old enough to know right from wrong, old enough to have found the courage to speak up. Eleanor stood and walked to the edge of the creek. The point is, we've both done things we're ashamed of. We've both been running from our pasts. Maybe that's why we found each other. Jacob joined her at the water's edge, and this time he did reach out his fingers, gently touching her arm. Eleanor, what you did or didn't do doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. And what you did doesn't make you a monster, Eleanor replied, covering his hand with hers. It makes you a man who loved his family enough to risk his soul for their sake. They stood together in silence, watching the creek flow past them toward an unknown destination. Eleanor felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, but a recognition that they had both been broken by their choices and might together find a way to heal. We should keep moving, Jacob said finally. We want to reach the homestead before dark. As they climbed back into the wagon and resumed their journey, Eleanor noticed that Jacob's shoulders had lost some of their rigid tension. The sharing of their darkest secrets had created a fragile intimacy between them, a foundation of honesty that might in time support something stronger. The landscape began to change as they traveled north, the rolling prairie giving way to more rugged terrain dotted with stands of pine and aspen. Eleanor found herself studying every ridge and outcropping, wondering if Marcus Garrett might be watching them from the shadows. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to voice her fears aloud. There, Jacob said, suddenly pointing to a valley that opened up below them as they crested a hill. That has to be it. Eleanor shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and looked where he was pointing. In the distance, she could see a partially constructed cabin sitting in a clearing beside a stream. Even from a distance, it was clear that the structure was unfinished walls that reached only halfway to where the roof should be, where windows and doors should fit piles of lumber scattered around the foundation like broken bones. "It's going to need a lot of work," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor studied the scene below them, taking in not just the unfinished cabin, but the broader picture of what they were inheriting. The clearing was larger than she had expected, easily big enough for a garden and outbuildings. The stream would provide water year-round, and the surrounding forest would supply timber and game. Most importantly, the valley was sheltered and defensible, surrounded by hills that would make it difficult for anyone to approach unseen. "It's perfect," she said, surprising Jacob with her enthusiasm. "Perfect." Jacob looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Eleanor, there's no roof, no doors or windows, no barn or chicken coop or well. We'll be lucky if it's habitable by winter." "Exactly," Eleanor said, her excitement growing as she began to envision the possibilities. "It's a blank slate. We can build it exactly the way we wanted it, make it truly ours instead of just taking over someone else's vision." Jacob guided the wagon down into the valley, his expression thoughtful. "You realize how much work that's going to be, even working from dawn to dusk. It'll take months to make that cabin livable." "Then we'd better get started," Eleanor replied with a determination that surprised even her. As they drew closer to the homestead, Eleanor could see more details of what they were facing. The previous owners had made a good start. The foundation was solid stone, carefully laid and level. The walls that existed were well constructed with tight joints and solid timber. But everything was open to the elements, and weeds had already begun to encroach on the cleared areas. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop beside the cabin and set the brake, then sat for a moment just staring at the structure that was supposed to become their home. Eleanor could practically hear the calculations running through his mind: how many board feet of lumber they would need, how long it would take to install a roof, what they would do for shelter while the work was being completed. "Jacob," she said softly, "we don't have to do this. If you think it's too much, we could try to find something else." Jacob turned to look at her, and Eleanor was surprised to see not discouragement in his expression, but something that looked almost like excitement. "No," he said slowly, "you're right. This is perfect. It's exactly what we need." "What do you mean?" Jacob climbed down from the wagon and reached up to help Eleanor down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her easily to the ground. "I mean that building this place is going to require everything we have, all our time, all our energy, all our focus. We won't have time to worry about whether we're compatible or whether this marriage was a mistake. We'll be too busy surviving." Eleanor understood what he was saying. The monumental task of completing the homestead would force them to work together, to depend on each other to build something tangible while they figured out how to build a relationship. It was both practical and symbolic. They would construct their home and their marriage simultaneously. "Where do we start?" she asked. Jacob walked slowly around the cabin, his trained eye assessing what had been done and what remained to be completed. "First priority is making this place weatherproof. We need a roof and at least temporary coverings for the door and window openings. After that, we can work on some basic furniture and getting ready for winter." Eleanor followed him around the structure, trying to see it through his eyes. "How long do you think it will take?" "If we're lucky and the weather holds 6 weeks for basic habitability, 3 months to be truly ready for winter." Jacob paused beside a window opening, running his hand along the smooth wood of the frame. "That's assuming we don't run into any major problems." As if summoned by his words, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet passing close overhead. Eleanor felt Jacob's body slam into hers as he tackled her to the ground behind the cabin wall, his weight driving the breath from her lungs. "Stay down," Jacob hissed, his body covering hers protectively as another shot rang out from the hills above them. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as the reality of their situation crashed over her. Marcus Garrett had found them, and their new life was about to be baptized in gunfire and blood. Jacob was already moving, pulling her deeper into the shelter of the unfinished cabin, while his eyes scanned the hillside for any sign of their attacker. "How many shots?" he asked tersely. "2. Eleanor managed, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay calm. "Rifle, not a pistol. He's up in those rocks on the southern slope." Jacob pointed to a cluster of boulders about 300 yards away. "Good position, he can see the whole valley from there." Another shot cracked across the valley, this one splintering wood from the cabin wall, inches from Jacob's head. Eleanor bit back a scream as splinters rained down on them. "The wagon," Jacob said grimly. "He's got us pinned down, but he can't see the horses from his position. If we can get to the wagon and get the animals unhitched, we might be able to use them for cover." "What about our supplies?" "Supplies won't matter if we're dead." Jacob looked around the incomplete cabin, obviously calculating angles and cover. "Eleanor, I need you to listen to me very carefully. When I say go, you're going to run for the wagon. Stay low, move fast, and don't look back. Get behind it and start unhitching the horses." "What about you?" Jacob's smile was grim and dangerous. "I'm going to give Mr. Garrett something to think about." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Jacob was moving, darting from the cabin toward a pile of lumber that would give him a better angle on the sniper's position. The movement drew immediate fire, 3 rapid shots that kicked up dirt around Jacob's feet but failed to find their mark. "Go!" Jacob shouted, and Eleanor ran. The 30 yards to the wagon felt like 30 miles as Eleanor sprinted across the open ground, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a bullet between her shoulder blades. But Garrett's attention was focused on Jacob, who had reached the lumber pile and was now returning fire with a rifle he had apparently retrieved from their supplies. Eleanor reached the wagon and threw herself behind it, her hands shaking as she began working on the leather straps that held the harness in place. The horses were dancing nervously, frightened by the gunfire, but well-trained enough not to bolt. From behind the lumber pile, she could hear Jacob's rifle answering Garrett's shots in a deadly rhythm. The sound was different from their attacker's weapon, deeper, more resonant, and somehow more authoritative. Eleanor realized that whatever else Jacob might be, he was an experienced marksman who knew how to handle himself in a gunfight. A bullet struck the wagon just above her head, sending splinters cascading down on her hair and shoulders. Eleanor fought down panic and focused on the harness, her fingers finally finding the release mechanism that would free the horses. "Eleanor," Jacob's voice carried across the clearing. "How are you doing?" "Almost finished," she called back, working frantically to complete the unhitching. Another volley of shots from the hillside was answered immediately by Jacob's rifle. Then Eleanor heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive metallic click of an empty chamber. "Reloading." Jacob shouted, and Eleanor knew he was warning her that their cover fire was about to stop. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, the nervous snorting of the horses, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of boots on rock as their attacker moved to a new position. Then Jacob's voice, calm and steady despite their circumstances. "Marcus, I know it's you up there. Why don't you come down and we'll settle this like men instead of you shooting at my wife from ambush?" The answer came in the form of more rifle fire, but this time the shots were coming from a different angle. Garrett had moved, trying to get around behind their position. Eleanor finally succeeded in freeing the horses and immediately led them to where Jacob was crouched behind the lumber pile. The animals would provide better cover than the wooden boards, and their mobility might give her and Jacob options for escape. "Good work," Jacob said grimly as she reached his position. He had reloaded his rifle and was scanning the hillside for any sign of movement. Garrett's repositioning, probably trying to get a shot at the horses. "What do we do?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, obviously weighing their options. "We wait for him to make a mistake. Garrett's angry and impatient, that makes him dangerous, but also reckless. Eventually, he'll expose himself trying to get a better shot." As if to prove Jacob's point, another shot rang out from much closer than before. Garrett had moved down from the rocks and was now firing from a position in the tree line, maybe 150 yards away. Jacob's response was immediate and devastating. His rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and Eleanor heard a cry of pain from the trees, followed by the sound of someone crashing through underbrush. "Did you hit him?" Eleanor whispered. "Winged him," Jacob replied with satisfaction. "Not enough to stop him, but enough to make him think twice about getting too close." The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western hills, and Eleanor realized with growing dread that they might be trapped here until dark. The thought of trying to defend their position in the darkness sent ice through her veins. "Jacob," she said quietly, "what happens when the sun goes down?" Jacob's expression was grim. Then the advantage shifts to him. Garrett knows these mountains, and he can move around in the dark while we're stuck in one place. Eleanor absorbed this information, that her mind racing through their options. What if we don't stay in one place? What if we use the darkness too? Jacob looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor pointed toward the stream that ran through the valley about 50 yards from their current position. "The creek bed is deep enough to provide cover, and it leads up into the hills behind us. If we could reach it after dark, we might be able to circle around behind Garrett." Jacob studied the terrain she was indicating, his expression thoughtful. "It's risky. If he spots us in the open, we'll be sitting ducks." "We're sitting ducks here too," Eleanor pointed out. "At least this way we're moving toward a solution instead of just waiting for him to work up the courage to rush us." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him turning the plan over in his mind, looking for flaws and alternatives. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. We wait until full dark, then move together. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. If things go wrong, you run for the trees and don't look back." Eleanor wanted to argue with that last instruction, but the look in Jacob's eyes told her this was not a negotiation. "Agreed." As the sun sank lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the gunfire from the tree line became more sporadic. Garrett was also waiting for darkness, conserving his ammunition and his energy for whatever he planned to do when the light failed. Eleanor found herself studying Jacob's profile as he kept watch, noting the calm professionalism with which he handled their deadly situation. This was not the grieving hermit she had married, but the man who had hunted down his family's killers with ruthless efficiency. The transformation was both reassuring and terrifying. "Jacob," she said quietly, "when we get out of this, and we will get out of this, I want you to promise me something." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the fading light. "What?" "Promise me you won't let Marcus Garrett's hatred turn you back into the man you were after your family died. Promise me you won't let his need for revenge destroy the chance we have to build something good here." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the war raging behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to hunt Garrett down and end this once and for all, battling against the part that wanted to protect what they were trying to build together. "I promise," he said finally, and Eleanor heard the weight of that commitment in his voice. "But Eleanor, if Garrett forces my hand, if it comes down to his life or ours, I won't hesitate to do what's necessary." Eleanor nodded, understanding that this was as much as she could ask for. The man she had married was capable of violence when circumstances demanded it, but he was also capable of choosing a different path when one was available. As full darkness settled over the valley like a heavy blanket, Jacob began checking his weapons and gathering the supplies they would need for their dangerous gambit. Eleanor watched him work, marveling at the efficiency of his movements and the quiet confidence he projected even in the face of mortal danger. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand to help her up. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the calloused strength of his fingers closing around hers. "Ready." Together they slipped into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of their shelter to hunt the man who was hunting them. The homestead that was supposed to be their sanctuary had become a battlefield, but Eleanor found herself thinking that maybe that was appropriate. If their marriage was going to survive, it would have to be forged in the fire of shared adversity, tested by dangers that would either destroy them or make them unbreakable. As they crept toward the creek bed under cover of darkness, Eleanor realized that this night would determine not just whether they lived or died, but what kind of people they would become if they survived. The choice between becoming victims or victors, between surrendering to fear or rising to meet their challenges, would be made in the next few hours. Behind them, the unfinished cabin stood like a promise in the darkness, a symbol of the life they were fighting to build together. And ahead of them, somewhere in the shadows, Marcus Garrett waited with his grief and his gun and his determination to destroy everything they hoped to become. Eleanor squeezed Jacob's hand tighter and followed him into the night, ready to fight for their future. The creek bed was deeper than Eleanor had anticipated, with smooth stones that shifted treacherously under their feet and ice-cold water that soaked through her boots within minutes. Jacob moved ahead of her like a ghost, his rifle held ready while his eyes constantly scanned the darkness above them. The sound of running water masked their movement, but also prevented them from hearing any approach by their pursuer. They had been moving upstream for nearly an hour when Jacob suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to stop Eleanor's forward progress. In the faint starlight, she could see him tilting his head, listening intently to something she couldn't hear over the babbling creek. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. Jacob didn't answer immediately. His entire body coiled like a spring as he strained to identify whatever had caught his attention. Then Eleanor heard it too, the soft scrape of leather against stone coming from somewhere above and ahead of them. Marcus Garrett was moving. Jacob pressed his mouth close to Eleanor's ear, his breath warm against her skin as he whispered instructions. "He's up there on the north bank, maybe 50 yards ahead. I'm going to work my way around behind him. You stay here and count to 300, then fire one shot straight up into the air." Eleanor's blood chilled at the thought of being left alone in the darkness while Jacob crept through enemy territory. What if something goes wrong? What if he finds you first? "Then you run," Jacob replied with grim finality. "Follow the creek back down to the valley, take one of the horses and ride for Cedar Falls. Don't try to be a hero, Eleanor, just survive." Before Eleanor could protest, Jacob was gone, melting into the shadows along the creek bank with a silence that spoke of hard-learned survival skills. Eleanor crouched alone in the cold water, counting slowly as she tried to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. 57, 58, 59. Somewhere in the darkness above, her two dangerous men were stalking each other through terrain that could conceal a dozen different forms of death. Eleanor found herself praying not just for Jacob's safety, but for the strength to do whatever might be required of her in the next few minutes. 112, 113. A twig snapped in the forest above her, followed by the soft thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to identify the source of the sounds. Had Jacob found Garrett, or had Garrett found Jacob? 215, 216. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Eleanor imagined Jacob lying wounded or dead in the forest while Marcus Garrett prepared to hunt her down like a cornered animal. The rifle in her hands felt impossibly heavy and alien, a tool she barely knew how to use, being called upon to save her life. 287, 288. Eleanor raised the rifle skyward, her finger trembling on the trigger as she prepared to fire the signal shot that would either reunite her with her husband or announce her position to his killer. The weight of that uncertainty was almost unbearable. 300. Eleanor pulled the trigger and the rifle's sharp crack echoed across the valley like thunder. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the creek bed around her, destroying her night vision and leaving her blind and vulnerable in the aftermath. For a moment that felt like eternity, nothing happened. Then the forest above her exploded into violence. Two rifles spoke almost simultaneously, their reports overlapping into a continuous roar of gunfire. Eleanor heard a man cry out in pain, followed by the sound of heavy boots crashing through underbrush. Someone was running, but in the darkness and chaos she couldn't tell who. "Eleanor!" Jacob's voice cut through the night like a lifeline. "Eleanor, where are you?" "Here," she called back, relief flooding through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "I'm here in the creek." Jacob appeared at the edge of the bank above her, his rifle still smoking in his hands, and a dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. Even in the dim starlight, Eleanor could see that he was favoring his right arm. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scrambling up the bank to reach him. "Just a graze," Jacob replied, though his voice was tight with pain. "Garrett got lucky with a shot before I could put him down." Eleanor's hands found the wound on Jacob's shoulder, feeling the warm wetness of blood seeping through his shirt. "Is he dead?" "I don't think so. Wounded maybe badly, but I heard him moving off toward the east ridge." Jacob winced as Eleanor's probing fingers found the edge of the bullet furrow. "He'll be back, though. This isn't over." Eleanor tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and began fashioning a rough bandage for Jacob's wound. "Then we need to get back to the homestead and prepare for another attack." Jacob caught her hands in his, stilling her ministrations. "Eleanor, there's something you need to understand. Marcus Garrett isn't going to give up. He's got nothing left to lose now. No family, no reputation, no future. He'll keep coming until one of us is dead." Eleanor met his gaze steadily in the darkness. "Then we'll have to make sure it's him and not us." The calm certainty in her voice seemed to surprise Jacob. "Eleanor, I'm talking about killing a man. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of battle, but hunting him down and executing him like I did those raiders in Kansas." "I know what you're talking about," Eleanor replied quietly. "And I know that sometimes there's no choice between being a killer and being a victim. Marcus Garrett made his choice when he robbed that bank and came after us. Now we have to make ours." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. The woman who had offered to marry him in a town square to save his life was gone, replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic. The frontier was changing her just as it had changed him. "All right," Jacob said finally, But we do this smart. No more stumbling around in the dark hoping to get lucky. We go back to the homestead, tend to our wounds, and make a plan. The journey back down the creek bed was slower and more treacherous with Jacob wounded, but they made it without incident. The homestead looked exactly as they had left it, half-finished and vulnerable, surrounded by open ground that would offer little protection in daylight. Eleanor helped Jacob into the shelter of the incomplete cabin, then began gathering supplies by feel in the darkness. Their medical provisions were limited: some clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey, and basic needle and thread, but it would have to suffice. "This is going to hurt," Eleanor warned as she poured whiskey over Jacob's wound. Jacob's jaw clenched, but he made no sound as the alcohol burned through the bullet furrow. Eleanor worked by touch, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as possible before binding it with strips of clean cloth. "You're getting good at this," Jacob observed through gritted teeth. "I'm hoping I won't have to get much better," Eleanor replied, tying off the bandage with more force than necessary. Jacob caught her hand as she finished, pulling her down to sit beside him on the pile of lumber that served as their only furniture. "Eleanor, I need to know something. Back there in the forest, when you said we might have to hunt Garrett down, did you mean it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would define not just their immediate strategy, but the kind of marriage they were building. "Jacob, 3 days ago, I was a sheltered judge's daughter who had never held a gun or slept outdoors or faced any real danger. Tonight I crept through a creek bed in the darkness to help ambush a man who wants to kill us both. Yes, I meant it." Jacob was quiet for a moment, absorbing this transformation. "The woman I married is disappearing, isn't she?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "She's just discovering who she really is underneath all those layers of civilization and expectation. The woman you married was always capable of this. She just never had a reason to prove it." Jacob lifted his good hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "I'm not sure whether to be proud of you or terrified for what this place is turning you into." "Be both," Eleanor advised, leaning into his touch. "I am." They spent the rest of the night in the shelter of the unfinished cabin, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Eleanor found herself studying Jacob's face in the pre-dawn light, noting the new lines of pain around his eyes and the way he unconsciously favored his wounded shoulder. The man she had married was already bearing scars from their new life together. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Jacob stirred from his fitful doze and immediately reached for his rifle. "We need to move. Garrett will be back as soon as he can see well enough to shoot accurately." Eleanor had been thinking about their tactical situation during her watch, and she had reached some uncomfortable conclusions. "Jacob, we can't keep playing defense. Every time Garrett attacks, there's a chance he'll get lucky and kill one of us. We need to take the initiative." "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor pointed toward the hills that surrounded their valley. "Garrett is wounded and alone. He's probably holed up somewhere up there, nursing his wounds and planning his next attack. If we can find his hiding place while he's weak and hurt, we could end this once and for all," Jacob finished grimly. "Eleanor, tracking a wounded man through hostile terrain is dangerous work. If we guess wrong about his location or walk into an ambush, if we stay here, we're just waiting for him to pick the time and place of our deaths," Eleanor countered. "At least this way we're making the choice." Jacob considered her proposal, his tactical mind weighing the risks and benefits of offensive action. "It would have to be soon while his wound is still slowing him down, and we'd need to be smart about it, no charging blindly into the hills hoping to stumble across him." Eleanor felt a surge of anticipation mixed with terror. "How do we find him?" Jacob stood slowly, testing his wounded shoulder's range of motion. "The same way I tracked those raiders in Kansas. Blood trail, disturbed vegetation, broken twigs. A wounded man leaves sign that a healthy one doesn't." They spent the next hour preparing for what might be their final confrontation with Marcus Garrett. Jacob checked their weapons and ammunition, while Eleanor gathered supplies for what could be a long hunt through difficult terrain. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley and reminding them both that every minute of delay gave their enemy more time to recover from his wounds. "There," Jacob said, pointing to a smear of dark staining on a boulder near the tree line. "He bled on that rock when he was retreating. The trail starts there." Eleanor followed Jacob up the slope, watching him read sign that was invisible to her untrained eyes. A broken branch here, a footprint in soft earth, their tiny spots of blood on leaves and stones, all of it painting a picture of Marcus Garrett's flight through the forest. "He's hurt worse than I thought," Jacob observed, kneeling beside a larger bloodstain on a fallen log. This is where he stopped to rest. See how the blood pooled. He was here for several minutes at least. Eleanor studied the evidence, trying to learn the skill that Jacob made look effortless. How far ahead of us is he? Hard to say. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Depends on how badly he's wounded and how much pain he can tolerate. Jacob stood and continued following the trail up the mountainside, but he's definitely heading for higher ground, probably looking for a defensible position where he can see us coming. The trail led them through increasingly rugged terrain, winding between massive boulders and stands of pine that blocked out much of the morning sun. Eleanor found herself grateful for the years of farm work that had strengthened her legs and lungs. Jacob was setting a punishing pace despite his wounded shoulder. "Jacob," she said during a brief rest stop, "what happens if we actually find him? I mean, what exactly are we planning to do?" Jacob's expression was grim as he checked the load in his rifle. "We're going to give him one chance to surrender and face trial for robbing that bank. If he refuses, we kill him." Eleanor finished, surprised by how little the prospect bothered her. "I kill him," Jacob corrected. "You stay back and cover my retreat if things go wrong." Eleanor was about to argue when Jacob suddenly froze, his head tilted in the listening posture she was beginning to recognize. This time she heard it too, the faint sound of someone coughing coming from somewhere above them. Jacob motioned for Eleanor to take cover behind a large pine while he crept forward to investigate. The coughing came again, followed by what sounded like labored breathing. Marcus Garrett was close, and from the sound of it, he was in considerable distress. Jacob returned after several minutes, his face tight with concentration. He's in a cave about 50 yards up the slope. Natural formation, good defensive position, but there's only one way in or out. He's trapped himself. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and fear. "What's the plan?" "I'm going to circle around and approach from above. There might be another entrance to the cave system, or at least a position where I can get a clear shot." Jacob handed Eleanor his spare pistol. "If he comes out of that cave, you put as many bullets into him as you can and then run. Don't try to be heroic." Eleanor took the heavy weapon, surprised by its weight and the cold purpose it represented. "Jacob, what if this doesn't work? What if he kills you?" Jacob cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes serious, but unafraid. "Then you ride for Cedar Falls and start a new life. Don't let my failure destroy your chance at happiness." Before Eleanor could protest this morbid instruction, Jacob was moving again, disappearing into the forest with the silent efficiency she was learning to associate with his darker skills. Eleanor settled into position behind her covering tree, the pistol heavy in her hands as she watched the cave entrance that supposedly concealed their tormentor. The waiting was almost unbearable. Eleanor found herself imagining a dozen different scenarios, most of them ending with Jacob's death and her own desperate flight through the wilderness. The morning sun climbed higher, and still nothing happened. Then she heard voices, faint but carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Garrett!" Jacob's voice echoed from somewhere above the cave. "Marcus Garrett, I know you're in there." The response was immediate and venomous. "Stone, come to finish what you started, you murdering bastard." "I've come to give you a chance to surrender," Jacob called back. "Throw out your weapons and we'll see that you get a fair trial for the bank robbery." Marcus Garrett's laughter was bitter and unhinged. "Fair trial? Like the fair trial you would have gotten in Foul Ridge. You think I'm fool enough to trust frontier justice?" Eleanor strained to locate Jacob's position by his voice, but the echoing effect of the rocks made it impossible to pinpoint. She could only hope he had found good cover for whatever was about to happen. "Garrett, you're wounded and trapped," Jacob continued. "Your only choices are surrender or death. Make the smart choice." "My only choice is to kill you before you kill me," Garrett snarled back. "Just like I killed that bank clerk who tried to stop me. Just like I'm going to kill your precious wife when I'm done with you." Eleanor felt ice flood her veins at the casual way Garrett spoke of murdering her. This was not a man who could be reasoned with or trusted to honor any agreement. This was a predator who needed to be put down for the safety of everyone around him. The negotiation continued for several more minutes, with Jacob offering increasingly generous terms, and Garrett responding with increasingly unhinged threats. Eleanor realized that Jacob was not actually trying to convince Garrett to surrender. He was gathering intelligence about the man's mental state and positioning while keeping him distracted. Then the talking stopped, and the forest fell into an ominous silence. Eleanor held her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was happening. The seconds stretched into minutes, and still nothing. Had Jacob been discovered? Was he even now lying wounded or dead somewhere above the cave? The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence, followed immediately by a scream of rage and pain from the cave. Eleanor heard the sound of someone scrambling over rocks, and suddenly Marcus Garrett burst from the cave entrance, his left arm hanging useless at his side and his rifle clutched in his good hand. Garrett's eyes found Eleanor immediately, and she saw madness burning in his gaze as he raised his weapon toward her. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor brought Jacob's pistol up her finger, finding the trigger just as Garrett's rifle barrel swung toward her chest. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Eleanor felt the wind of Garrett's bullet as it passed close enough to her head to disturb her hair. Her own shot took Garrett in the center of his chest, the heavy pistol bucking in her hands with surprising violence. Marcus Garrett staggered backward, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers as he stared down at the spreading crimson stain on his shirt. "You," Garrett whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "You actually—" He collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward onto his face, his body twitching once before going still. Eleanor stared at the motionless form, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had killed a man, actually pulled a trigger and ended a human life. "Eleanor," Jacob's voice carried from above, tight with concern. "Eleanor, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Garrett's dead." Jacob appeared at the cave entrance within minutes, his face pale with shock and something that might have been pride. "I saw what happened. Good shooting." Eleanor looked down at the pistol in her hands, then at the body of Marcus Garrett sprawled in the pine needles and stone. "I killed him," she said quietly, as if speaking the words would make the reality more comprehensible. "Yes," Jacob said, simply moving to check Garrett's body for any signs of life. "You did what you had to do to protect yourself and me. There's no shame in that." Eleanor felt a strange disconnection from her own actions, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold. "I thought I would feel different, guilty or horrified or something, but I just feel empty." Jacob straightened from his examination of Garrett's body, his expression understanding. "That's normal. The feelings will come later when your mind has time to process what happened. For now, you're still in survival mode." They spent the next hour searching Garrett's possessions and securing the area. The dead man had been carrying a significant amount of money, presumably from the bank robbery, along with enough ammunition to wage a prolonged siege. Eleanor found herself thinking that if their confrontation had been delayed much longer, Garrett might have been the one walking away. "We should head back," Jacob said finally. "We need to report Garrett's death to the authorities, and I want to get my shoulder properly treated before infection sets in." The journey back to the homestead felt surreal to Eleanor. She had entered these mountains as a frightened bride hiding behind her husband's protection. She was returning as someone who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Jacob," she said as they reached the valley floor, "what do we tell people about what happened up there?" Jacob considered the question carefully. "We tell them the truth. Marcus Garrett was a bank robber and a killer who attacked us on our own property. You defended yourself when he tried to murder you. Any reasonable person will understand that." Eleanor nodded, though she suspected the reality would be more complicated than Jacob's assessment suggested. Frontier communities might accept a man's right to defend himself and his property, but a woman who killed in combat was still an anomaly that would generate gossip and speculation. As they approached the unfinished cabin that was supposed to become their home, Eleanor found herself seeing it with new eyes. The structure that had seemed so daunting yesterday now looked manageable, a project they could complete together, a symbol of their determination to build something lasting despite the violence that had marked their first days as husband and wife. "We're going to need to make some changes," Jacob observed, studying the cabin's vulnerable design. "More defensible positions, better fields of fire, maybe a hidden root cellar where you could take shelter if something like this happens again." Eleanor was startled by the implication that violence might be a recurring feature of their new life. "Do you think there will be other men like Marcus Garrett?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills with the wariness that she was learning was his natural state. "Eleanor, we've chosen to live on the frontier, far from law and civilization. Out here, people settle their own problems and protect their own property. There will always be men like Garrett, desperate, violent, looking for easy targets. Eleanor absorbed this sobering assessment of their future prospects. Then we'll deal with them the same way we dealt with Garrett. Jacob turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw surprise and something deeper in his gray eyes. You're really committed to this life, aren't you? Even knowing what it might cost us. Eleanor thought about the question as she looked around their valley, the incomplete cabin, the fresh graves they would need to dig the endless work that lay ahead of them. 3 days ago, she had been a failed mail-order bride with no prospects and no future. Now, she was a homesteader's wife with blood on her hands and steel in her spine. Jacob, she said finally, I've spent my whole life being afraid of my father's disapproval, afraid of scandal, afraid of making the wrong choices. Today, I stopped being afraid. I'm not going back to that life. Jacob stepped closer, his good arm reaching out to pull her against his chest. Eleanor could feel the steady beat of his heart, the solid strength of his body, the promise of safety and partnership that he represented. Mrs. Stone, Jacob said softly, I think our marriage is going to work out just fine. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the truth of those words settling into her bones. They had been tested by violence and emerged stronger. They had faced death together and chosen to fight rather than surrender. Most importantly, they had begun to trust each other with their deepest fears and their greatest hopes. The homestead still needed a roof walls and 100 other improvements before it could truly be called home. But as Eleanor stood in her husband's arms, surrounded by the wild beauty of their valley and the promise of their shared future, she knew they had already built the most important foundation of all, a partnership forged in adversity and tempered by the unforgiving demands of frontier life. The woman who had offered to marry a caged stranger was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more capable. The man who had lived alone with his grief was learning to hope again. Together they would build not just a home, but a life worthy of the sacrifices they had made to find each other. 2 months after Marcus Garrett's death, Eleanor stood in the doorway of their completed cabin, watching Jacob split firewood in the crisp October air. His shoulder had healed well, though she could see him favor it slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. The rhythmic sound of the axe biting into seasoned oak had become one of her favorite sounds, a promise of warmth through the coming winter and evidence of the life they were building together. The transformation of their homestead had been remarkable. What had started as a half-finished shell was now a proper home, complete with a solid roof, glazed windows Jacob had crafted himself, and a stone fireplace that Eleanor had helped lay stone by stone. The cabin felt like a fortress and a sanctuary rolled into one, defensible but welcoming, practical but beautiful in its simple proportions. Mrs. Stone, a familiar voice called from the trail that led up from the valley. You folks receiving visitors today? Eleanor turned to see Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan approaching on horseback, accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize. The marshal looked relaxed, his rifle remaining in its saddle holster, a good sign that this was a social call rather than an official one. Jacob set down his axe and walked over to join Eleanor, automatically positioning himself slightly in front of her. Old habits from their dangerous early days died hard, and Eleanor found his protective instincts oddly comforting rather than confining. Marshal Brennan, Jacob said with a nod. What brings you out this way? Brennan dismounted and helped his companion down from her horse, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the homestead. I'd like you folks to meet Mrs. Sarah Winters. She and her husband run the general store in Cedar Falls. Mrs. Winters stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately put Eleanor at ease. Mr. and Mrs. Stone, I've been hoping to meet you ever since Tom told us about what happened with Marcus Garrett. The whole town's been talking about how you handled yourselves. Eleanor felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. The story of their confrontation with Garrett had spread throughout the territory, growing more dramatic with each telling. Some versions painted Eleanor as a cold-blooded killer, others as a helpless victim who got lucky. None of them captured the complex reality of what had actually happened. Ma'am, Eleanor said carefully, I hope the talk hasn't been too harsh. We did what we had to do to protect ourselves. Mrs. Winters laughed, a sound full of genuine warmth. Harsh. My dear, you've become something of a legend, a woman who can hold her own in a gunfight and help build a homestead from scratch. That's exactly the kind of neighbor we need out here. Jacob's posture relaxed slightly at Mrs. Winters's friendly tone. "Would you folks like to come in for coffee? Eleanor makes it strong enough to wake the dead." "We'd be delighted," Mrs. Winters replied. "Actually, that's part of why we're here. My husband and I wanted to invite you both to our harvest celebration next weekend. The whole community gathers to help process the late crops and prepare for winter. It's become quite the tradition." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jacob, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his gray eyes. They had become so accustomed to their solitary life that the prospect of socializing with a group of strangers felt almost foreign. "That's very kind of you," Eleanor said diplomatically, "but we're still getting our own place ready for winter. I'm not sure we could spare the time." Mrs. Winters waved away the objection with a practical gesture. "Nonsense. The whole point of the celebration is neighbors helping neighbors. You bring what work you need done and everyone pitches in. By the end of the weekend, you'll have your winter preparations finished and a dozen new friends to boot." Deputy Marshal Brennan spoke up from where he was examining Jacob's woodpile with professional interest. "Mrs. Winters is right. Community's everything out here. When the snow gets deep and the wolves get hungry, you'll want to know your neighbors are the kind of people who'll ride through a blizzard to help if you need it." Jacob's expression remained thoughtful. "Marshal, I appreciate the invitation, but Eleanor and I haven't exactly been social lately. We might not fit in with your community gathering." "Son," Brennan said with a slight smile, "you killed 3 bank robbers and raiders in Kansas, then faced down Marcus Garrett to protect your wife and property. Eleanor here put a bullet in Garrett's heart when he tried to murder her. Trust me, you'll fit in just fine with our crowd." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the Marshal's casual recounting of their violent history. "Marshal, we're not looking to build a reputation based on killing people." "And you shouldn't," Mrs. Winters said firmly, "but out here people respect those who can handle themselves when trouble comes calling. The fact that you'd rather be building than fighting just makes folks respect you more." The conversation continued over coffee in their small but comfortable cabin, with Mrs. Winters and Marshal Brennan sharing news from Cedar Falls and the surrounding homesteads. Eleanor found herself hungry for contact with the outside world, realizing how isolated she and Jacob had become in their focus on survival and construction. "There's something else," Mrs. Winters said as they prepared to leave. "My husband's been looking for someone with carpentry skills to help expand the store. From what I can see of your work here, Jacob, you'd be perfect for the job. Part-time, good pay, and it would give you both a chance to get to know people in town." Jacob looked around their cabin, taking in the hand-fitted joints and custom details that had occupied months of his time. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Winters, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave Eleanor alone here for extended periods." "Who said anything about leaving me alone?" Eleanor interjected, surprising everyone, including herself. "I could come to town with you. Maybe Mrs. Winters could use help in the store, or I could find other work." Mrs. Winters' face lit up with enthusiasm. "Eleanor, that's a wonderful idea. I've been trying to convince my husband to hire help for months. A woman with your education and practical experience would be invaluable." Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect of using her mind for something other than survival calculations. What kind of work would be involved? Bookkeeping, correspondence, dealing with customers, maybe some teaching. We've got several families who want their children to learn proper reading and writing. Mrs. Winters paused, studying Eleanor's face carefully. "It wouldn't be full-time, and you could arrange your schedule around the homestead's needs." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the idea of exposing themselves to the wider community. Eleanor could see the conflict in his expression, the part of him that craved human connection, warring with the part that had learned to trust only in solitude. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "Both offers. We've gotten used to depending only on ourselves." "Of course," Mrs. Winters replied with understanding. "But Jacob, Eleanor, don't let what happened with Marcus Garrett convince you that the whole world is hostile. Most people out here are good folks trying to build decent lives just like you." After their visitors left, Eleanor and Jacob found themselves sitting on their front porch as the sun set behind the western mountains, each lost in their own thoughts about Mrs. Winters' invitations. "What do you think?" Eleanor asked finally. Jacob was whittling a piece of pine, his hands moving with the unconscious skill that never failed to fascinate Eleanor. "I think we can't hide up here forever, and I think you miss using your mind for more than figuring out how to preserve vegetables and mend clothes." Eleanor was surprised by his perceptiveness. Is it that obvious? Eleanor, you were educated to be a judge's daughter, not a frontier wife. You've adapted better than I ever dreamed possible, but I can see you sometimes looking at our books like they're old friends you haven't talked to in years. Eleanor curled up in her chair, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. I do miss intellectual conversation and teaching. I used to help my father prepare his legal arguments, and I loved the challenge of organizing complex information into clear presentations. Then we should go to the harvest celebration, Jacob said decisively, and we should consider the winter's job offer seriously. Eleanor studied his profile in the fading light, noting the determined set of his jaw. Jacob, are you sure I know how much you value our privacy and independence? Jacob was quiet for a moment, his whittling knife pausing in its work. Eleanor, when I was living alone in the mountains, I convinced myself that isolation was safety. But these past months with you have reminded me that humans aren't meant to live completely alone. We need community even if it comes with risks. What changed your mind? Jacob set down his whittling and turned to face her fully. You did. Watching you adapt to this life, seeing how you've grown stronger and more confident, it's shown me that people can change, that the past doesn't have to define the future. If you can transform from a sheltered judge's daughter into a woman who builds cabins and faces down killers, then maybe I can learn to trust again. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Jacob, you've been trusting. You've been trusting me. That's different, Jacob replied. Trusting you felt natural from the beginning, like recognizing something I'd been looking for without knowing it. Trusting a whole community, that's going to take more courage. Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become second nature over the months of their marriage. Then, we'll be courageous together, just like we've done everything else. The following Saturday found them loading their wagon with preserves, fresh bread, and a batch of Eleanor's apple pies for the harvest celebration. Jacob had spent the week crafting a set of wooden bowls as his contribution to the community, gathering his hands, producing work that was both functional and beautiful. The Winters farm was bustling with activity when they arrived, perhaps 40 people working in organized groups to process vegetables, smoke meat, and prepare for the long winter ahead. Children ran between the work areas while women supervised massive cooking operations, and men repaired tools and equipment that would be needed through the cold months. Jacob, Eleanor. Mrs. Winters hurried over to greet them, her face flushed with exertion and excitement. I'm so glad you decided to come. Let me introduce you to everyone. The next hour passed in a blur of names and faces as Eleanor found herself welcomed into a community she hadn't known existed. These weren't the suspicious, fearful townspeople of Fow Ridge, but practical frontier families who valued competence and character over social standing or reputation. So you're the woman who shot Marcus Garrett, said a weathered rancher named Tom Mitchell, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. Good riddance. That family always thought their money put them above the law. Eleanor braced herself for uncomfortable questions or moral judgments, but instead found herself drawn into a practical discussion about defensive preparations for homesteads. These people understood that violence was sometimes necessary for survival, and they respected her for handling it competently rather than criticizing her for participating in it. Jacob, meanwhile, had been absorbed into a group of men examining farming equipment, his expertise with tools and wood immediately recognized and valued. Eleanor watched him demonstrate improvements to a plow design, noting how his natural reserve was gradually giving way to enthusiasm as he found himself among people who appreciated his skills. Your husband's quite the craftsman, observed a woman named Martha Collins, following Eleanor's gaze. My Tom's been trying to build a proper barn door for 2 years. Never gets the hinges quite right. Jacob has very skilled hands. Eleanor agreed, then blushed at the unintended intimacy of the comment. Martha laughed good-naturedly. I can see that from the way he moves, and from the way you look at him. It's nice to see a couple who actually like each other. Too many marriages out here are just business arrangements. Eleanor found herself thinking about the irony of Martha's observation that a marriage that had begun as exactly the kind of business arrangement she was dismissing had evolved into something that looked like genuine affection to outside observers. Mrs. Stone. A new voice interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor turned to see a young woman about her own age approaching with a baby in her arms. I'm Rebecca Jameson. I heard you might be interested in teaching children. I am, Eleanor replied, immediately drawn to the young mother's earnest expression. Do you have children who need instruction? Rebecca's face lit up with relief. 3 of them and another on the way. The nearest school is 2 days' ride, and I'm trying to teach them myself, but she gestured helplessly at the baby in her arms. It's hard to concentrate on letters and numbers with little ones demanding attention. Eleanor felt a familiar excitement at the prospect of intellectual challenge. What ages are your children? Mary's 9, John's 7, and little Sam is 5. They're bright children, but they need proper instruction if they're going to have any kind of future beyond farming. I'd be happy to work with them, Eleanor said immediately. We could arrange lessons either at your place or ours, whatever works better for your family. Rebecca's gratitude was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Stone, you have no idea what this means to us. Out here, education can be the difference between our children having choices or being trapped by circumstances. As the day progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn into half a dozen similar conversations. Parents eager for their children to learn reading and arithmetic. Women interested in sharing knowledge about preserving food and treating illness. Men curious about Jacob's construction techniques and tool-making skills. By evening, both she and Jacob had accumulated enough work commitments to keep them busy through the winter and well into the following spring. Feels good, doesn't it? Mrs. Winters observed as they helped clean up after the communal dinner. Being part of something larger than just yourselves. Eleanor paused in her dishwashing to consider the question. It does, but it's also frightening. We've gotten used to controlling our own destiny, not depending on others or having others depend on us. That's the paradox of frontier life, Mrs. Winters replied with a knowing smile. You have to be completely self-reliant and completely community-minded at the same time. Strong enough to survive alone, generous enough to help your neighbors, wise enough to know when you need each situation. As they prepared to leave that evening, Jacob loaded their wagon with gifts from their new neighbors, preserved fruits, dried meat, hand-knitted mittens, and a dozen other items that spoke of practical generosity and genuine welcome. Well, Mrs. Stone, Jacob said as they drove home under a star-filled sky, I think we've just acquired a whole lot of new responsibilities. Eleanor snuggled closer to him on the wagon seat, enjoying the warmth of his body and the contentment that had settled over her like a comfortable blanket. Are you regretting the decision to come? Not for a minute, Jacob replied, his arm tightening around her. Though I have to admit the idea of teaching Rebecca Jameson's children while helping Tom Mitchell build his barn while working part-time for the Winters, it's going to be a busy winter. Eleanor laughed at the mild panic in his voice. Jacob Stone, are you afraid of being too successful? Jacob was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the moonlight. I'm afraid of forgetting how quickly everything can be taken away. For 3 years I lived with nothing to lose except my own life. Now you have things worth protecting again, Eleanor finished softly. A home, a community, a future. And me. Especially you, Jacob agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. Eleanor, I need you to know something. When I married you in Fow Ridge, I thought I was just accepting a lifeline, a way to avoid hanging for something I didn't do. I never expected. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race as she sensed Jacob approaching something important, something that had been building between them through months of shared work and gradual trust. What didn't you expect? She asked quietly. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop beside their creek, the sound of running water providing a peaceful backdrop to his words. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. They had never spoken of love before, though she had felt it growing between them like a carefully tended garden. Hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a gift she hadn't dared hope for. Jacob, she whispered, turning in his arms to face him fully. I love you too. I think I have for months, but I was afraid to say it, afraid you might think I was just grateful for being saved. Jacob's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Eleanor Hayes Stone, you didn't just save my life in that town square, you saved my soul. You showed me that I was still capable of being more than just a broken man with blood on his hands. And you showed me that I was capable of being more than just a frightened woman hiding from her mistakes. Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. You helped me discover who I really am underneath all those layers of fear and expectation. When Jacob kissed her this time, it was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss in the Fow Ridge town square. This was a kiss between two people who had chosen each other not out of desperation, but out of love, who had built something real and lasting through months of shared adversity and mutual respect. "Mrs. Stone," Jacob said, when they finally parted, his voice rough with emotion, "I think it's time we made this marriage real in every sense of the word." Eleanor felt heat flood through her at the implication of his words, but also a deep sense of rightness that surprised her with its intensity. "I think you're right, Mr. Stone." The wagon ride home passed in charged silence, both of them acutely aware that they were about to cross a threshold that would transform their practical partnership into something deeper and more intimate. Eleanor found herself nervous, but not afraid. Jacob had proven his gentleness and consideration in a dozen different ways over the months of their marriage. Their cabin felt different when they entered it that night, not just a shelter they had built together, but a true home where they would begin the next chapter of their life as husband and wife in every sense of the term. Jacob lit the fire, while Eleanor turned down their bed, simple domestic actions that felt charged with new meaning. "Eleanor," Jacob said softly, moving to stand behind her as she smoothed the quilts Mrs. Winters had given them. "Are you certain about this? We don't have to—" Eleanor turned in his arms, seeing the mixture of desire and uncertainty in his gray eyes. "Jacob, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to be your wife completely. I want to build a real marriage with you, not just a convenient arrangement." Jacob's answer was to lift her in his arms and carry her to their bed, his movements gentle but sure. As he set her down, Eleanor felt the last of her old fears and insecurities fall away like discarded clothing. The woman who had been afraid of her own shadow was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to claim it. The night that followed was a revelation for both of them, not just of physical intimacy, but of emotional connection that transformed their partnership into something deeper and more unshakable than either had thought possible. When Eleanor finally fell asleep in Jacob's arms, she felt truly married for the first time since speaking her vows in that dusty town square. Dawn found them still entwined, and Eleanor woke to find Jacob watching her with an expression of wonder that made her heart race all over again. "Good morning, Mrs. Stone," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," Eleanor replied, stretching luxuriously against his warmth. "How do you feel about starting our real marriage?" Jacob's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "I feel like the luckiest man in the territory, maybe the luckiest man alive." Eleanor curled closer to him, marveling at how natural it felt to wake up in his arms, how right it seemed to begin each day with this connection between them. "Jacob, what do you think our life will look like a year from now?" Jacob considered the question, his hands stroking gently through her hair. "I think we'll have a bigger cabin, maybe with a proper workshop attached. I think we'll have established ourselves in the community, maybe saved enough money to expand our land holdings. And I think—" "What?" Eleanor prompted when he hesitated. Jacob's hand moved to rest gently on her stomach, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the implication of the gesture. "I think we might have started a family of our own." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, the possibility he was suggesting both thrilling and terrifying. "Is that what you want, children?" "With you, yes," Jacob said without hesitation. "I want to watch you teach our children to read and write. I want to show them how to build things with their hands and how to protect what matters to them. I want to give them the childhood my first children never got to finish." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the emotion in Jacob's voice. She knew he was thinking of Emma and Thomas, the children who had died with their mother in Kansas. The idea that their love might create new life, new hope, new possibilities for joy seemed like the most beautiful form of redemption imaginable. "Then that's what we'll work toward," Eleanor said firmly. "A larger cabin, a thriving homestead, and a family of our own. We'll build something so strong and beautiful that it honors both the life we've found together and the lives that were lost before we met." Jacob pulled her closer, his arms tightening around her as if he could protect her from all the dangers and uncertainties that lay ahead. "Eleanor, I promise you whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, I will never stop fighting for this life we're building. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope," Jacob said simply. "Hope for a future worth living." Eleanor kissed him, then pouring all her love and commitment into the gesture. Outside their cabin, the sun was rising over their valley, painting the mountains gold and promising another day of work and possibility. They had traveled a long journey from that dusty town square where a desperate bride had offered to marry a caged stranger. But every step had brought them closer to this moment. Two broken souls who had found healing in each other's love and strength, in their shared determination to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The frontier had tested them with violence and hardship, isolation and fear. But it had also given them the freedom to become who they were meant to be, far from the expectations and limitations of their former lives. Eleanor Hayes. Stone and Jacob Stone, no longer strangers bound by desperation, but partners united by love, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the unshakable confidence that they were stronger together than either could ever be alone. As Eleanor lay in her husband's arms, listening to the sound of water running through their valley and feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, she knew that every risk she had taken, every fear she had overcome, every moment of doubt she had endured had been worth it for this. For the chance to love and be loved completely, for the opportunity to build a life that was entirely their own choosing. The woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in Fow Ridge with nothing but a broken dream and an empty future was gone forever. In her place was Eleanor Stone, homesteader, teacher, wife, and survivor, ready to embrace whatever adventures and challenges the frontier might offer, secure in the knowledge that she had found not just a home, but a love that could weather any storm.